Hello, my name is Christina Lennon, and in this second session, we're going to talk about the responsibilities you have for serving on a board of directors. So there are three primary responsibilities: duty of care, duty of loyalty, and duty of obedience. We're going to cover those as far as a few expectations of you as a board member. The first is duty of care, to stay informed and ask questions. So one of your main roles is to come to board meetings prepared so that you can ask good questions. And don't be afraid to ask seemingly naive questions, or if details are being discussed, to back up and ask about the big picture. Sometimes a conversation really needs this. The second item under duty of care is financial oversight. So while ACPE has an active finance committee that is budgeting and reviewing the financial statements on a regular basis, as a board member, it is your fiduciary responsibility to also understand these statements. So there are four that you will want to be familiar with: the balance sheet, income statement, audit, and 990. Let's take a look at them. The first document is the balance sheet. This is a snapshot of the financial health of the organization at any one point in time. It's going to list the assets, which will include everything ACPE owns, money in the bank, as well as the value of your capital assets, and compare them against the liabilities, or everything that ACPE owes, including payroll, accounts receivable, and also any long-term financing like mortgages or loans, to determine if you have net assets, which would be your surplus. Net assets can be restricted or unrestricted based on donor designation or board vote. Let's look at a diagram. As you actually look at your balance sheet, the assets will be the first items listed, and again, they include cash, inventory, capital assets, like property or even technology and office equipment, the value of those things. And then we subtract any liabilities, such as payroll or short-term line of credit that you might have, as well as long-term liabilities such as mortgages and loans, to get net assets. And net assets that are unrestricted can be used for anything, reinvested right back into the program. Restricted assets have to be used for that restriction. And sometimes a board will restrict some types of assets. For example, it's common for a board to restrict gifts that come in from estates, because they're typically surprise gifts. We don't ever know when they're going to arrive. And the idea is they're a legacy gift. So often the board will restrict those to be used for an endowment or a rainy day fund. It's not all the time, but that's very common. So your balance sheet gives you an overall picture of the stamina, um, the long-term health of the organization. I, however, like looking at the income statement. So let's look at that next. The income statement is really your financial report card. It's the document that your annual budget will be based on. It looks at what's coming in and what's going out. So when you look at the income statement, it's set up just like the balance sheet. Income comes first and includes things like grants, donations, earned income, and then you subtract from that the programmatic expenses such as payroll, office supplies, program supplies, and you can find out whether you're running at a surplus, which means you have money left over, or you're running at a deficit. This is the document that will say money in, money out, and let you know how you are doing meeting your annual budget. I like this document because you can also compare year over year and look at whether your income or expenses are moving up or down. Each organization has different categories under income and expense. Things like income would be things like special events or grants, as we discussed, and expenses could be professional fees, office supplies. A lot of times you might not understand exactly what's in those categories or what those categories mean when you're first looking at the income statement. And don't be afraid to ask, because if you're really going to get into comparing um, income versus expense, or how we're doing this year in comparison to how we did last year, or if we're on budget, you'll need to understand what's in all of those categories. And so don't be shy in asking good questions. Then every year, an external auditor will perform an audit on the organization's finances. This is very important for your organization, and lots of funders will ask for this audit. The auditor is chosen by the audit committee, but the results are shared with the entire board. And you need to think of your auditor as your financial consultants. So at the end of the audit presentation, they will give recommendations moving forward. And those recommendations can be things like tweaking the process in which you record checks coming into the building, or moving something from a management and general expense to a program expense. It'll make your overhead look a little bit better. All kinds of suggestions, but they also can give you suggestions when you have questions. Say you have a question about the new tax law. Your auditors will be able to answer that and how that affects you. So it's a good back and forth relationship, and the audit is the final product at the end of the year. Then the Form 990 is the document that you turn into the IRS each year, and it explains the activities, governance, and financial health of the organization. Now, what's important to remember is this becomes a public document. Anyone can view your 990 on guidestar.org. So I encourage you to look up the 990 that's available for ACPE and just look it over, get familiar with it, um, because that is almost a marketing tool now. There's opportunity for you to talk about your programs, to talk about your mission, and you want to use all of those opportunities, because this is the document that funders will access. Sometimes, or even partners, sometimes before they even contact you, they'll look up your 990 and read a little bit about you. It really talks about the viability and efficiency of the nonprofit. So you want to make sure you're um, using this document wisely in communicating to the public what you do and who you are. Duty of care also means making sure you are at the board meeting, present and ready to discuss, reading the minutes between meetings, making sure they accurately reflect the conversation, and doing your homework before the meetings as far as committee reports or anything else that you've been given, so that the time together as a board is not a time in which you are getting caught up to speed with what's going on. You are already ready to discuss, understand the current situation, and ready to ask questions. That'll make your time together as a board so much more productive. Now, the second job of a board member is duty of loyalty. And again, this means mission first. We talked about this in the first webinar a little bit. Each board member must sign a conflict of interest policy, and this is because we always want to put the mission above self, right? We don't want anything that would get in the way of furthering the mission. It also means that the board has a unified message upon leaving the boardroom. So healthy debate is good for the organization. I think it creates more creative solutions and plans. But when you leave that boardroom, before you leave that boardroom, you have created a common language that everyone uses going forward, so that you look unified and you are positive ambassadors for the organization moving forward. Otherwise, it's just incredibly disruptive to the organization. And it doesn't put the mission first. So we always want to make sure we're putting the mission. The third is duty of obedience. So this is being knowledgeable of the bylaws and following the bylaws, and also following state and federal laws. There are more state and federal laws surrounding the responsibilities of a nonprofit board member after Sarbanes-Oxley. We'll take a look at that. Sarbanes-Oxley for nonprofits came down and said that we must have certified financial statements, must have signed conflict of interest policies from board members, whistleblower protection, document destruction protocols, and also you must have an audit. So there are more stipulations now for nonprofits that you need to be aware of. So in addition to the legal roles that you have serving on a board, there are certain expectations that you have as a board member. The first one is to attend meetings. Be present when the board meets, ready to give your input and ask great questions. Serve on a committee. So not just being on the board of directors, but also being active in a work group that is developing the action plans for the strategic goals the board sets. Make sure that when you come to a meeting, you are prepared. You have done all of the pre-reading so that you are ready to discuss and ask questions. As a board member of ACPE, you are a part of the leadership and you set the tone for giving. So ACPE should be at the very top of your philanthropic priorities for contributions. In fact, some donors want to know that there's 100% board participation before they will give to the organization. They believe that if it's not important enough for you to give a meaningful gift, then it's not worth their investment. Be an ambassador for the organization, and as part of that, share your networks and open doors for ACPE. So this means not just working within the board, but working within the community to further the mission and goals of ACPE by opening your Rolodex and making those connections that could really make a difference. And of course, putting ACPE's mission above self. Now, good board members ask good questions. It's important to be inquisitive. Don't be afraid of asking something that's seemingly obvious or naive, because I would bet that other people in the room are thinking the same thing. When you ask a question, ask it in a spirit of making the organization stronger. Be constructive and not critical as you ask questions. Now, this is that I want to share 6 questions that might help you distinguish whether something is board work or management work or committee work, right? So it needs to be discussed at the board if it's big, if it's about the future, if it's core to the mission. Is it a high-level policy decision that needs resolution? Is a red flag flying? Is there a big concern? Or does the CEO want and need the board support? These would be questions I would ask myself as to whether this is a board issue or a committee or staff issue. In conclusion, your 3 primary legal responsibilities are duty of care, duty of loyalty, and duty of obedience. Now, there's a lot more that you can read on this. If you want to visit boardsource.org, that's a great spot for looking at some sample documents. It's really great website on all things board related. Khan Academy has some great information about the fiscal management and documents of a nonprofit. GuideStar is where you can find any 501c3's 990. So I encourage you to look up ACPE's 990 on GuideStar and maybe compare it with a few others. And then also the National Council of Nonprofits. These are the sites that I used in composing this webinar. Thank you so much for joining me.